Right. Jonathan, I think this time, hopefully, we're live and it is streaming. I've no doubt that one or two of my viewers might come back and say, we still can't see you, we're still in a doom loop, but hopefully we're in.
Fingers
Welcome
crossed.
to the podcast, second or third attempt to go live. I'm clearly not designed for the tech side of talk, but thank you for joining me. And as we've done the rather lengthy intro, we'll just do it rather more shortly.
Yeah.
And we're on live, so we're there. So just in brief, you and I met some 5 years ago at the beginning of Heart. There were a number
We
of us
did.
that were beginning to get a little bit suspicious about what was going on. I was coming at it from a completely non-medical, non-scientific angle and thinking there was a lot of stuff that was a bit suspicious. There were meant to be lots of people dying. There were no body bags. There was no curfew. There were some strange instructions from quite early on about masks and not masks and yes masks. And anybody with even a non-scientific background could see that masks weren't working and the meshes were far too big for the pathogens and all sorts of stuff. So we were beginning to get quite suspicious, which isn't to say that I wasn't myself quite concerned. We were one of the first insurers in London to agree to let people work from home very early on because we were concerned that we wanted to keep people safe and mentally safe. But I remember when 2 weeks to flatten the curve came out and my colleagues were saying, we'll see you in 2 weeks. I said, no, I don't think so. Probably see you in 6 months or so. And they all thought I was mad. But that's where we met. And you were co-chair then, until you have been until very recently, with Dr. Claire Craig at Heart Group. And Heart was trying to get awareness from our politicians, who we at that point rather perhaps naively thought just didn't know anything that was really going on, didn't know what the science, whether the science they were being told was true, and felt that by giving them some data, we could help them start the debate in Parliament or among the executive.
Oh, how naive!
How naive we were, and I guess it took us. I think Mike Eden at that point was still also in the background, not
Yeah.
in the foreground, but certainly in the background. I mean, it took us some months to realise that that was a bit of a busted flush of an idea. And I remember feeling rather silly that the amount of conversations we had, and I won't name them, but with a number of politicians on direct groups where we were giving them information and they were very interested in making lots of notes. And I recall one of them saying, well, we don't have access to number 10. You try. And I think that was the point at which we realised this was not the way that we were going to go
Was
forward.
that
And
the we had a Zoom meeting
yes,
with about 5 politicians. I think maybe might have been kind of arranged or brokered through Graham Brady, who was my MP
indeed,
at the time.
yeah,
And I just remember we were so sort of had so much adrenaline for that. We
yes,
thought that finally we'd got through to the seat of power and that we were
yeah,
going to have an opportunity to drum some sense into them and change things. And then they basically just all sat there saying nothing. And
yeah,
kind of, it was at that moment I realized, gosh, we're in for a very, very long
yeah.
war of attrition here, basically, between government and the citizenry.
And there
So
were things. I mean, look, many of us have rehashed this over many podcasts, and this is not the most constructive thing for us to do, but it is just interesting to set it in to sort of remember some of these things, because I remember, my own family and we're all split on this. Basically, always just coming back and saying, "Well, you have no medical background. What how come? How do you think?" And I would just go for the logical arguments. The traditional old pub argument: you can sit down in the pub and eat and not wear a mask. You have to stand up. You have to put the mask on because then the virus is dangerous. How does that work?
or I mean, you're right that we do have to remember it because there has to be some sort of reckoning at some point. I mean, you got to remember that our MPs debated in Parliament, whether a Scotch egg on its own was a substantial meal or not, or whether it had to 2 Scotch eggs was a meal, 1 Scotch egg, I think maybe with fries, was a meal, but a Scotch egg on its own was not a meal, and then this would determine whether or not you were allowed into a pub or mixing with 3 people or 4 people or whatever nonsense they were talking about. And the sad and depressing thing is that basically nobody has been held to account for, for these completely ridiculous anodyne conversations that they were having. The same people are basically in charge now.
And then it began to get quite sort of autocratic in a way, because then there were talks about mask mandates, and we were hearing information even from Fauci in the States at the time, who at one point was saying, no, there's no call to wear masks, they don't work. And next minute he was wearing 3 himself, or at least he was when he was being filmed by certain channels. And then we would see MPs entering number 10 and taking their masks off as they entered number 10.
Yeah.
And so some of this was so blatant and so obvious.
There was one with a group of people. I think one of them was Boris Johnson. I think it might have been Ursula von der Leyen, or as I like to call her, Ursula von der Lying. It's a great nickname. I think there was some photo shoot, about 3 or 4 of them, a photo shoot, and they literally pull their masks off for the photograph and then just take them off and walk off, carry on chatting to each other. I mean, so I think it is a very serious observation that people in power were telling the citizens that this is really dangerous and you had to follow these rules, and yet there is no evidence, or hardly any evidence, that any of these people who came up with these rules shared that personal fear at all. And this is a huge paradox that remains unexamined, uninvestigated, and the frustrating thing from my perspective is there's very little curiosity about it. So we've got a situation where we've lived through this cataclysm where just a series of lies and carefully crafted propaganda have been spewed out of all our media for months and months on end, which clearly the people in power didn't believe in. Why? To what end? And where's the reckoning? It's very frustrating.
And that's the gap that we still have no clarity on. And there's lots of speculation. We know Andrew Bridgen's been quite vocal on some of the stuff that happened in the background, and some of the conversations he had with people who were basically advising him, just to lie low, don't talk about this. What is it you need, or what is it you want? But this, you may well be right, but this is not the time to be talking about it, which was quite sinister very quickly. And of course, once you've got people, as many of them were, continuing to be frightened and continuing to believe that this was a very dangerous thing, it's very hard to get them then to think rationally and logically. And until you sort of embrace that fear, and still today people are saying, I've got COVID and don't come near me, and I go out of my way to give them a huge hug and say, that's fine, I'm quite relaxed. I've had it in March, whatever it was. I had it in March 2020, and did feel terrible, but I think most of that, looking back, it was psychological. I was expecting it to be terrible, and I hadn't had the flu for years, so it was a novel thing for me.
As you all know, I've written pretty extensively on what we call the nocebo effect, including, I don't know if did you read the series of 3 articles that I wrote with Gary?
Yes.
Gary was the lead author. I chipped in and polished it a little bit, and I think they're pretty good articles. They were published in the Conservative Woman, TCW, a few weeks ago. I don't know if you read them, but
I speed read the first 2, but I haven't managed to get around to the third. I think
this is we don't talk about nocebo effect. Isn't talked about very much, interestingly, even though there is tons and tons in the literature about it. We know all about the placebo effect, obviously, because we talk about placebos in clinical trials and so on. But we don't talk about the nocebo effect very much at all. I think largely because the very notion of, just to explain actually to everybody, the nocebo effect is where something that gives you the expectation of being ill or your symptoms getting worse actually makes you get worse, and that's the opposite of the placebo effect, which is where you give something with the expectation that you get better, and lo and behold, you do get better. And the nocebo effect is incredibly powerful. There are some cracking stories in the literature of nocebo effect, but nobody talks about it in relation to what it may have done during the what I call fake pandemic. So, I mean, are you interested to hear a bit more about these
very much
fascinating
so.
stories? Yeah. There's two.
I agree with you. This is people are memory holding this, and the problem with that is come again, and people will do the same thing again. And now there's no rule that says the same, whatever the number was, 20, 30, 40% won't do the same again. But the more people that are forced to think about this and think about it logically and not belittle their own intelligence by saying, I'm not a scientist, this can't be right, the better. So I do think it does need to talk about. We've completely skipped the introduction. We'll come back to that, but let's stay on this theme because I think it's worth it.
Yeah. So something done to somebody with the expectation that they will develop new symptoms or their existing symptoms will get worse. And there's tons of literature, as I said. So two stories from the literature spring to mind. One is there was a guy who, this is written up as a report, in a scientific paper. There's a guy who took he was in a clinical trial, and he swallowed the whole of his clinical trial medication in one go, which he wasn't supposed to do, and his blood pressure fell through the floor, and he became semi-conscious, low blood pressure. They couldn't get his blood pressure up. He ended up in hospital, and whatever they gave him, a drip and so on, they couldn't get his blood pressure to rise. And at some point, the pharmaceutical company was contacted, and eventually they got through to them and found that he had been on placebo. So everything he'd taken was placebo. And as soon as he was told that, his blood pressure immediately normalized, and he was discharged virtually immediately afterwards. And the interesting thing about that is that this nocebo effect it's not just what you might term psychological symptoms. These are somatic, measurable, objectively measurable symptoms of blood pressure were affected by a belief. And the other great example I have is actually written up. It's from the Common Cold Unit research, and they. So this is, let me get this right. So they're trying to inoculate people with colds, basically. For want of a better word, they're sort of swapping snot from people with colds into people without colds. Not very nice. So
actually making them eat it as well, which sounds really disgusting. But
and so what they did with the people who were supervising and looking after the people who were staying in these kind of flats that they had, where they looked after and monitored people, the volunteers, were not supposed to give anything away in terms of what the person had received. And on this particular occasion, the person, the attendant, gave away the fact that the person had the cold-inducing broth they called it, the one that was meant to contain all the germs, rather than the sterile one. And the person then developed a full-blown cold. The next day, she came to see the subject, the volunteer, and said, you might have got the impression from what I told you that you had the active broth containing all the germs, but actually I was wrong. You didn't. You actually had the sterile one, and then the person's cold virtually immediately cleared up. So really interesting sort of effects. I mean, there are lots of other effects that are linked or could be termed, kind of mass hysterical effects, etc., such as the children and teenagers in Portugal. This is about 20 years ago, watching a soap opera about a weird virus, and they all came down with something ill, and many of them went to hospital for investigation, and in the end they concluded that they all had some sort of mass hysterical illness from watching the TV. So these belief systems can induce definite symptoms of things. And my theory is that people, the whole fear propaganda, and the relentlessness of that, the negative expectations that people had if they were to catch it, was a significant ingredient in making people really potentially quite seriously ill, in particular breathless. So I mean, you've got to remember that these people also have been told that this magic test that they do, if it lights up, if it has that line across it, or if they get a note saying, if they get told it's a positive test, that they've got a really serious illness. And I think it is negligent of us not to investigate the possibility that telling these people they had a really serious illness, when in fact they possibly had just had a cold, was responsible for quite severe symptomatology.
And I think the thing is that if you, I mean, I'd almost go a step further and say that in the cases you've quoted and some of the ones I've read, the psychosomatic factor was the actual cause. It wasn't, there was nothing else that was the cause. And if you'd given somebody the pathogenic stuff and said it isn't, they wouldn't have become ill, and vice versa. So actually,
well, I think it could be a combination of them.
Yes.
Testing positive, whatever that means. Maybe they had some, people get 3 or 4 colds a year, don't they? You get
or not
usually, so or not. Maybe if it happened, they have a cold symptom, they test for it using these useless tests, which I've written a lot about as well, and I've written a lot on my own Substack and also on Where Are the Numbers, which is Norman Fenton's and Martin Neal's Substack, and together we've written a lot on the tests, on the I hesitate to use the word accuracy, because it suggests that the test could ever be accurate, i.e. there was something worth measuring in the first place, which I don't believe, but how misleading these tests can be. So if you have a cold symptom, makes you do a test, it comes up positive because they're rubbish, and then you think you've got COVID, and you think you've got a deadly illness. I mean, what is that actually going to do to people? I was going to say, one of the things that I've written about in a subsequent article, which is about hyperventilation, which is interesting. So a lot of people ended up complaining of breathlessness when they had this positive test and they had COVID, etc., whatever COVID was, and then they start measuring their SATs using these pulse oximeters, which were, of course, mass-produced, came from China, probably cost 50p to make or something, and they are being used in their millions. And of course, we've never used them before in their millions, and so we don't really know what people's numbers do, their SATs numbers do in normal circumstances, if people are ill, have colds and flus, etc. There's a very interesting article that was pointed out to me by somebody who is on X and on Substack by the name of Paramaniac. Do you follow him at all?
No.
So don't know who he is. He's never really gone public with his name, but he's a paramedic, and his theory is that the happy hypoxia, the people going in breathless with low SATs from the pulse oximeter, they're basically having panic attacks and hyperventilating, and then having a low oxygen saturation afterwards. And I actually, only until recently, I didn't believe this was possible, because I couldn't find any evidence that hyperventilation resulted in lowering of your oxygen saturation, until he recently posted a paper from some Japanese doctor volunteers, about 14 or 16 of them. This is a paper from about 30 years ago, where they got them to do voluntary hyperventilation for 3 minutes, and then a rest, and then another 3 minutes. So this is fit, healthy people in their 20s, and they're told to hyperventilate, as much as they can for 3 minutes, and then they measured their oxygen saturation, and some of the oxygen saturations went down into the 60s and 70s, and in fact, virtually every volunteer had readings that were way below the level that they said these people are seriously ill and need ventilating. So, this is an area of research that hasn't been looked into in much detail.
And what's really interesting about that is and we've been through this a number of discussions, and I know there was one where you were at, and there's been a lot written about it too. People find it difficult to shake off the beliefs they've had from the experience they had. It's quite normal. And so if they believe they've had COVID, or they've had COVID again, or they've got long COVID and they feel ill, and the symptoms fit those rather loose symptoms that were thrown at us by governments as to what they, which was, could have been anything from common cold to a flu, or just anything, frankly, then they will want to associate that pain and to undo their experience, their lived experience, through presenting them with facts of what psychosomatic influences can do to people. Doesn't work. It's almost as though one would have to take everybody through a life experiment, literally everybody taking part in it, and doing exactly what you were describing earlier, with possibly with just placebos, but being told they're not, one of them isn't, so that you're not doing them any harm, and then halfway through changing it and saying it isn't, and then saying to them, look, this is why this happened, this is why it was worse, or whatever the outcome was, because you believed that because I just don't think that people react rationally.
Well, there is some research. There is some research out there that suggests that when you present facts to people that are contrary to what they believed, that they actually sort of double down on the belief that they have, instead of changing their opinion to match the facts that you put in front of them. They kind of ignore what's being put in. That probably happens on both sides as well, to be honest. I don't think anybody's immune from prior assumptions molding your belief system. But there are definitely some powerful sort of psychological factors at play that are probably evolved protection mechanisms that stop people from facing up to what's being done to them. And maybe it's just these, there are some people who cannot face the reality of the fact that it was all for nothing. The government lied to us and then continued to lie to us, and a huge numbers of people were killed, both from measures in 2020 and from the rollout of the mRNA products. So they will do anything to psychologically shield themselves from having to face that reality.
And I think that goes for a lot of people, and it's in a way understandable. On the other hand, we've often talked about people becoming, I don't want to use the word enlightened because it's the wrong word, but people, with their eyes being open to what has happened. And I don't know of anybody who's come back from that saying, no, I want to go back and believe, I'll take the blue pill again, to use that phraseology. There were a few, well, there were one or two who were, but one wasn't quite sure whether they were paid to come back or whether they somehow were influenced to jump back onto the blue side of the fence, as it were. But broadly speaking, if people have seen and had corroborated what they've seen by some persuasive scientific evidence, it's quite difficult to get people to come back. And however uncomfortable it is, most people in the end do want to know the truth. And it's the difficulty is getting people to that point where they're prepared to face that. And if people
do they want to know the truth? I'm not sure what you just said is right, actually. You said most people want to know the truth. I don't know if that's... I think a lot of people want to contract out their, the arbiter of truth to people that they trust, and because they think it's beyond them to understand certain things, so they're happy to go with, I'll trust that person for that. I'll trust that person for that. And it is, I have to say, it is wearing on the psyche to not to trust, not to trust any of the authorities for anything you're told. It's quite wearing because you have to sort of think to yourself, well, if that's important, I really need to dig into that in detail, because I can't really believe that what I was taught 40 years ago anymore. But I haven't got time to do that, and literally, not we don't have enough time in the day to investigate all the things that we think are wrong with with science and medicine, let alone all the politics and history. So
Well, I think it's also you're right. I mean, it's also disconcerting to have to look at everything you hear and immediately be suspicious that it can't be true, and therefore and always think the worst. So I mean, there is a sort of a black pill factor to that, which is probably also quite depressing over time. But listen, we've jumped in, which is fine. But let's do the intro halfway through, because not everybody
why
knows
not?
who you are. So you run your own Substack now, but your career initially was in the biomedical industry, so where I think you set up some companies. But you've also got an interesting academic career, and as I perhaps rather really said earlier, you've got more degrees than a compass, which is very impressive. But you've spent quite a lot of
Hardly, but
years in your life
yeah,
studying, and
yeah.
I think it'd be
I mean,
interesting for viewers and listeners to know a bit more, what took you there, and what the logic was, and
yeah. Well, just
what
a sort of
dreams.
a brief canter through my career is that I started off life in medicine, studied medicine in Aberdeen in Scotland, and then was training towards doing cardiology, actually, when I heard about. I was actually it was the late 80s, and I'd also just got married, and I was getting slightly fed up about the spending 1 in 3 of every night and 1 in 3 every weekend at a very, very miserable Victorian hospital, and being treated like absolute crap. I mean, junior doctors then were treated really, really badly. And I heard of somebody who had gone into the industry and was involved in running clinical trials and sort of traveling around the country and flying around the world, involved in that world. And so I thought, I'll give that a go, and spent 4 years doing that, actually running an international sort of clinical trial program for a drug that was used in heart failure. And that was interesting. A very interesting thing to do. Lots of management, some stats, some biology in there as well. So a complete mixture. So I went in there as a doctor, because the pharma industry employs obviously lots of doctors. I went in there as one of those, and then myself and a colleague, we decided we saw a gap in the market for a platform to automate some of the processes used in clinical trials. Actually, the logistics management of it, the just-in-time delivery of drugs and other materials that are used in the clinical trials worldwide. And we developed a platform to do that. We built up a company from 2 people to, I think it was 600 or 700 by the time we sold it, a decade later, and that was also very interesting. So sold that business to an American company, and then I retrained, became a lawyer, worked as a barrister for a few years, really as a sort of intellectual challenge to myself, and so went to law school in my mid-40s. Became a barrister, and but then went sort of back into. I missed the business world, and I went back into business. It's a very difficult. It's an ultra competitive and exhausting job for a young person to do, being at the bar, being a junior barrister in particular, let alone for somebody with, at the time, 4 school-age children. So I went back into kind of the business world, and have been there sort of ever since, doing a variety of businesses in
What would you
biomedical
put?
sector and property. Yeah.
What would you put that down to? That shift to let me try. I mean, it's a brave thing to do. Let me try and let's do a law degree. Let's become a barrister. I mean, presumably you were successful in the businesses you were in. That sounds like a sort of intellectual restlessness that hit you.
There is a bit of an intellectual restlessness. I can't deny it. Yeah, I do have quite a a low boredom threshold. In fact, my wife is always says she's quite surprised that I haven't changed wives, so been married for 36 years. So
Congratulations.
don't, yeah, managed to not get bored with that one. So
And I think the so having tried, as it were, both, it's a bit more difficult to set up businesses in law other than as a practicing lawyer, which basically means setting up chambers or firm solicitors, which is a completely different kettle of fish, or going into private practice, which is also, if you like being a principal, isn't ideal. So presumably it's that which made you then go back to the medical side, because that's where setting up a business you'd had some experience and
it was fun enough when we set up the business in the 90s. My colleague and I, when we set up our original business, we decided we want to go into business together, and we thought, well, what do we really like? And what we really liked at the time was curry, football, and cricket. And then kind of we thought we'll set up a business, something to do with that. Then reality struck. Actually, you know what? We know a lot about clinical trials. Let's set up a business involving clinical trials. And there, a life lesson really is, if you're going into kind of business in any kind of capacity, trying to mold something, you've really got to understand it inside out, and it's dangerous if you don't fully understand it, or you can get to know it very quickly, but it always try to stick to the knitting, as they say.
And how much do you think the insight you had from that was instrumental in you noticing, perhaps earlier than most, or certainly earlier than many, that things were not quite as they should be at the beginning of the COVID fiasco?
I think that it's possibly not the specific experience and knowledge that I had, but more the variety. So I think that part of the problem that we've seen over the last, well, I'll say over the last 5 years, but actually there are examples that go back before the COVID event. A lot of our problems come from the siloing of knowledge and expertise. So to give you an example, the lockdown was predicated on a model, and that model, that's all he knew about, was running a computer model. And then of course the people who said let's do a lockdown never looked at the broader harms potentially of the lockdown, because they were just focused on their bit. And then the people who, I think if I remember rightly, the people who were tasked with looking at the economic impact of it, they said, oh, we didn't look at that because we thought the people who decided on the lockdowns were doing that. And so you get this siloing of expertise. And of course, this is actually how really bad things happen, how atrocities happen, in fact, where people just do their small part of it, and in isolation what they're doing might not be viewed as that harmful, but when you put all these things together in a train, they can often turn out to be very harmful. I always think of a good example of that is in the the transgender, call it malarkey or whatever that's going on, all these. So you've got here, people, all the people think they're doing good. So the teacher who has a quiet word with the parents, I think your child should have a referral to a psychologist because it's showing that there might be gender dysphoria there. So they think they're doing good. Then the psychologist thinks they're doing good. Then they move on to an expert in a referral center, who then moves on to a surgeon, and all these people are doing a little bit, and they're not seeing the overall picture. And at the end, you've got a chain going right from a teacher who thinks they're worthy and doing good, right through to what I regard as, in most cases, basically needless mutilation at the end, for some cult-like belief system. So when people are too specialized and siloed in their expertise and responsibilities, these things can be added together and nobody can see the big picture. And I think there's a lot of that in where we ended up
Yeah,
during the last few years.
and in that, I mean, there will be people who look over the fence to the next part of the thing and think, well, that's interesting because I didn't think that, but those people presumably are not encouraged to think that, and are kept in their box, because that's how whistleblowers come about, isn't it? I mean, they see perhaps a slightly bigger picture, or perhaps they even see just a process in their own bit that isn't right,
Yeah.
and then some of them are moved to be courageous enough to come forward. But it can't be.
That's right. Although interestingly, it's like we've got all these supposed protections against some of these things happen. So, like what's it called? The Whistleblowing Act. I think Protected Disclosures Act or something like that it's called, isn't it? I think is that what it's called in our country? I can't remember. But anyway, we have that kind of act. We also have the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah.
And like a lot of things that have been introduced by governments over the last, not just this government, but governments going back several decades, they end up being used for the very purpose which is contrary to what they were introduced for. So, for example, Freedom of Information Act is meant to herald a new era of transparency, and yet it seems to me that what it actually enables there to be central control over the way in which these requests are treated, and then you can apply in a fairly subjective manner, you can apply fairly draconian rules to stop people seeing what they should be seeing, and but yet you've given it an official stamp. Oh, it's under our FOI Act and blah blah blah. And actually, I'm not sure there is any more transparency under the FOI Act than there ever was before, because all the important stuff, for example, that all the stuff that Claire has been trying to get hold of, the vaccinated and unvaccinated data, has been held from view, and sometimes for the most ludicrous reasons, which. Interestingly, and I know you wanted to talk a little bit about juries, sort of does feed into the discussion about that, because of course these decisions that are being made are made by judges alone, and there's an example of where it's unrealistic really to expect judges who are paid by the state to necessarily to always for their judgment not to be clouded by the fact that they are state employees. They are part of that system. And the thing about juries is these people have got no kind of theoretically anyway, have got no axe to grind. They might have political views and so on, but they're just there to do that job on that day. They're independent and they go off when it's been done with no comeback, and it is a right during most criminal procedures. It is a right that has existed since Magna Carta, and I think the idea that can be taken away from people, the idea of being judged by your peers, without it being in a manifesto, for pre-election manifesto, or in a referendum, preferably a referendum, I think is absolutely obscene, actually, and a complete authoritarian overreach of government that it should be making that decision.
Well, I mean, I think the numbers don't stack up, because they say, when I haven't checked this, they say it's only about 3% of everything that goes to the courts is in front of juries. Now, whether that's true or not, and there's been some tinkering before, it doesn't actually change the fact that the fear has to be reasonable, that if you're not in front of a jury of your peers, there is more likely to be an influence of the person who pays that judge. And even in the Blair period, he got rid of the magistrates, who were also not paid by the state, and were doing most of them doing it pro bono, a lot of them doing it pro bono. So I think it's quite reasonable for people to be concerned about that, because even if, let's just say that this government had the full faith and trust of most of the people, and they go away thinking, well, I can see the logic for this. It's going to reduce waiting times. It's going to do whatever. So we'll go along with it, and it makes sense. It'll cut down people sitting on remand or whatever while they're waiting. And this government would never abuse it, even if people believe that. The naivety to think that a future government might not abuse it or give that power back. I mean, I'm always reminded of the fact that the World War II emergency powers were finally abolished in the late 70s. They were on the statute books until the late 70s.
Well,
And
that's
that's
is a very
lifetime.
absolutely. Well, a power that is transferred from people to government is very, very rarely ever repealed and given back to the people, and that's a scary thing. That's actually why in 2020 I was really, really depressed and concerned about the fact that people were so willingly rolling over and allowing the government to dictate to them how they lived their life to such intricate detail, because I thought that would it just kind of recalibrate the relationship between citizen and state, away from something that was not very British at all, about state interference in life. I think it's quite a British characteristic to respect people's individuality, and people have eccentric, sometimes objectionable views, which they hold, but they're slightly bonkers, but so what, kind of thing. Whereas we seem to be moved into an era where everything has to be, you have to have approved opinions, otherwise the state will come down on you. And it is worrying if you think about the expansion of hate crime definitions into effect, things like, you remember there were calls for people who did anything that would discourage people to have vaccinations during the pandemic. There were calls for that to be regarded as a hate crime, and in fact, I don't know if it ever was officially regarded as a hate crime, but certainly, remember, they did use 77th Brigade, which was an anti-terror group, to spy on us. So that's the sort of general modus operandi. But if you can imagine various crimes that you might be accused of in that sphere, now you would have the right to have a jury decide those crimes. In the future, that might be a judge, and we know how the judges reacted to the various pieces of litigation that went on over the fake pandemic event. So, because, for example, we had the Simon Dolan case, when he was fighting the lockdowns, and the judge famously said, well, this pandemic thing must be serious because I saw it on the BBC. He actually said that.
Well, I think the thing that it is important for people to get behind this. I think the thing that seems to me really to be the most relevant part of this, with a government that has the majority this government has, and bearing in mind it's a majority of MPs as opposed to a majority of the country that voted for it, or even a significantly large minority that voted for it. The enormous power it has because it's got such a large majority in the Commons actually means it can pass the most extraordinary laws just simply under a majority. And when you make perhaps somewhat simplistic comparisons between different political systems, and you compare, let's say, ours in that respect with the US, a prime minister with such a large majority of seats in the House is for his term, depending on his own party or her own party's ability to remove them as PM, is subject only to that, is effectively an elected dictator for the period of office. And therefore it's perfectly possible for an outrageous law to be passed, which then sits on statute books, and the courts have to adhere to it. The only way you can challenge that law is through the jury system. It's the only system that if you're in front of a jury and the jury thinks it's unfair in those circumstances, that becomes case law. And I think that is the most important thing that people need to remember.
Not sure even jurors can do that, because jurors have to follow judges' directions on matters of law, don't they?
True, but if in a criminal case, if the evidence of lack of guilt of a criminal offence, they can say this person is not guilty. of a crime, and it becomes much more of a moral, ethical, reasonable question. And you wouldn't, I mean, absent that, we would be endorsing some of the convictions of, whether it's in the Twitter sphere or wherever it is, of people saying things which got higher penalties than those who committed actual crimes in the sense of rapes or whatever it is. Now, I know that's again a different area because
well, of course, yeah. We had the. It did strike me there was a case I read about in. It happened in, where was it? Somewhere in the northeast of England, like near Scarborough or somewhere like that. Where did you see that? Where two guys chased a guy who was actually the unintended, mistaken identity. He wasn't actually their target, but they chased him. He escaped, and they were wearing hazmat suits and carrying 2 machetes, and they were obviously planning to. It looked like, to my mind, they were planning to chop him up, murder him and chop him up, because all these hazmat suits and machetes were found by a member of the public the next day, and there was no debate about the fact that they had used those. They were going to use those. They brought them there to the scene. And these guys were given, I think, 28 months for. Can't remember what the actual technical crime was, but they weren't charged with attempted murder at all. They were given 28 months for that, and yet, the Lucy Connolly, who case we all know about, I think she was originally sentenced, I think, to 31 months.
Yeah.
For her tweet that she then took down immediately, and even whatever you think about the tweet itself, whatever you say in a tweet, you then take down immediately, and etc. To be sentenced for longer than 2 people who were clearly planning to chop somebody up is just obscene.
Yeah.
Something seriously wrong there.
Well, and to come back to the point, I mean, the jury, if one imagines a case where a jury heard that, it would have to be persuaded that someone like Lucy Connolly's.
Well, remember that sentencing decisions, of course, are made by the judge, so not the jury.
But in order to get there first, the jury has to be persuaded that her, well, let's not use her, but that a person's statement of that description was enough to incite someone to commit some act of violence somewhere. That has to be the first test, doesn't it? And that from the perspective of it becoming a statute, that is no longer then in question for a judge, whereas for a jury it still would be. And that's where the difference lies. I mean, I don't know that there've been some very eloquent arguments in both directions over the last few days from people who've taken opposing sides. And if you heard David Lammy speak today, he almost put it across as this is definitive and done, and this is what we're going to do. I don't think the reality is quite like that, though. I don't, from what I can gather from the bit of research I've done, I don't believe Lammy has the power to unilaterally eliminate.
I think it needs an act of parliament, surely, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I think it's.
And if it doesn't need an act of parliament, then that's a problem in itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, this has been a big problem over the last, again, not just the last 5 years, but going back a long ways, the abuse of legislation and writing in too many bits of legislation that are then able to be varied by statutory instrument by the minister or secretary of state and blah blah blah. So there's too much. There's too much, the Henry VIII powers, as they call them. There's too many of those in our statutes, and just the sheer volume of legislation, new legislation that's come out as well, is quite extraordinary, really, over the last few decades.
It's an area where we stand amongst our, if there's such a thing as an Anglospheric brother, but in the Anglosphere, it's unique. The jury system is unique to the Anglosphere. It's therefore not really understood or appreciated in the European codified system, and I'm not sure they understand what the fuss is about. And I think the argument that's coming from that side says, well, we function perfectly well without it. We've got a codified system. It works perfectly well. I don't know whether it does or not, but there are certainly cases that we're all aware of. Heiner Füllmich in Germany is one, where there's clearly been an abuse of a system. The man's not gone to a proper trial yet, and he's been in prison for 2 years plus. So I think it's very important that people take this seriously, and make representations to their MPs, and write about it, talk about it, because this is, once gone, it's very hard to see how it could come back.
Yeah, I mean, it's such the way the government behaves. It's almost as if, and actually Alison Pearson said this on her podcast the other day. She said it's almost as if they are deliberately pursuing a scorched earth policy, in that they realize that this is a one-term government, and they're going to do basically try to embed as much change towards that is consistent with their ideology as they possibly can during that time, and forget all the ramifications. By the way, just on the topic of politics and the government and budgets and so on, it just occurred to me the other day that we're talking about Rachel Reeves and her black hole of 20 billion or whatever she claimed it was. I can't remember the figure exactly, but those are the sorts of sums that we've been agonizing over, whether it's 20 billion or 15 billion or a 4 billion surplus or whatever, these tiny numbers. And it's worth remembering that the total cost of the pandemic related measures was probably, it's various figures around, but the OBR says it was well over 300 billion. And the reality is it's probably a lot more than that. So the sums of money that were just, to use Boris's phrase, spaffed up the wall in 2020 and the few years after that are quite extraordinarily huge compared with these. So if we're now agonizing over 4 billion, 10 billion, whatever, why are we not saying, what about that 300 billion? Where's that gone? Why can you just produce that, print money to do that and think it has no consequences? Where's the accountability for that? Where's the investigation into what was spent, why it was spent, who made money out of it, and so on? It's a really disturbing thought when you think about it, because it means that basically it seems to mean that, because the answer would be, well, we had to spend that money, it was an emergency, we had to spend it all. But so is that right? Are we now in a world where the government can self-declare an emergency and it can then basically print a few $100 billion to counter that emergency, and nobody questions it? Because if that's the world we're in, given that so many people made so much money out of the fake pandemic, because remember, it was basically a wealth transfer exercise of trillions from taxpayers into a few pockets of some mainly big corporations, then why wouldn't they be incentivized to just do it again with another thing? And you could argue that the whole climate stuff, the climate emergency is just basically another one of those, basically, which I think it is.
Absolutely. And if you, just to put a bit of flesh around that point, one of the impacts of the COVID measures was the hollowing out of the high street of small shops. Suddenly everybody found, even if they weren't persuaded of the convenience before, they found that Amazon was a necessity. And Amazon extended its reach.
And the big supermarkets as well. They did okay. Except they couldn't sell certain things, children's toys, and they had to put their tape.
But they could deliver. I mean, they could deliver. That was the key bit. Whatever they could deliver. And so and of course Amazon was very well lined up. I don't single them out, but I've mentioned them because they're so obvious. But they were very well set up to gear themselves up for that. And if you may have looked at the numbers at the time, but I remember looking at them from a risk perspective, and thinking, how is this something that I would accept as a credit risk, given that it's never made any money. It's got
It was
massive.
profitable by then. It
It
was.
was just about profitable by
Was
then,
it? I thought it was
because
profitable way before that.
yeah, it had basically undercut everybody.
Yeah, I know
And,
that's how it gained its market share.
yeah, and starved out all its other producers who just couldn't compete, and it was doing so at a loss to get market share. And once it had the market share, obviously it was also very efficient, to be fair to it, in the way it processed things. But obviously, small shops, could not compete with it. And then you had a pandemic, or whatever you want to call it, that caused everybody to have to rely on stuff being delivered because they either were too frightened to go out, or because the shops were too far away, or whatever the reasons were, and that completely reinforced their position. And so I think it's people should not overlook that there was some very good examples of the impact.
Well, and of course, and also a very good example of how perverse incentives can drive a situation and keep maintaining it. So you've got, if you think about all the people who were, you might call, pandemicists, people who are driving the whole pandemic narrative, they're all benefiting from it in some way. So they're either directly profiting from it, or they are writing about it and increasing their status in their community, scientific community, or getting job promotions, or accruing power through laws, regulations, and so on, policing those. So there was a perverse incentive there to maintain it, the system that's self-perpetuating. And I think that's true of, I think these kind of unintended vicious circles or cycles, whichever one you want to call it, I think are quite important drivers of human behavior, actually, and of situations that arise. To be honest,
Sorry.
No, you can't.
What's your looking back now for 5 years or so, can we look at the future with any confidence that the population will behave substantially differently if there was to be something of a repeat, whether it's a virus news, or whether it's something more
alien invasion,
draconian, I was going to say, in terms of climate, which I think less people believe, to be honest, but it would not be beyond the wit of man for another pathogen to be unearthed from somewhere, and there to be a rinse repeat that looks perhaps on the face of it more threatening. What's your assessment of what humanity, what we've learned, and whether it changes the percentage of how people reacted?
Somebody once said, I can't remember who it was, said the only lesson from history that we learn is that we don't learn the lessons from history. And I think I'm a bit bearish really about that, because of course this particular event came only a decade or so after one which was dissected. This swine flu pandemic was, dissected in documentary series in the EU, in august, respected reports by professionals, and saying that this is and everything that was. It looks like the if you wanted to perpetrate another one of those events, you would learn from that, and that looks like what they've done. But the people themselves didn't seem to have learned anything from that. So there's the whole thing about this rushed vaccine rollout, and the panic, the fear, the rollout of mass testing, etc., etc. Nothing seemed to have been learned. So that was just a decade, which is slightly disconcerting, because that's within everybody's memory. And now you see people talking about a lot about the next pandemic, and they say, which there will surely be.
Yeah.
So I'm not optimistic, to be honest. I think it could be pulled out. And of course, people who know me will know that this is why I'm so concerned about this whole lab leak kind of what I call a trope, because I don't think there was anything there that needed any form of response at all. But all the people who are now in power in the States publicly, I say the States because that's probably the driver of the global response to these things, such as a response is needed, which I don't think it was. But anyway, the people who are now in positions of power, none of them question whether there was anything needing a response. They're all fully bought into the fact that there was definitely something that we needed a global coordinated international response to. It's just that we'd wanted a different type of international response with different decisions. And of course, my view is that many of our problems in the world are caused by, over-engineered solutions to fantasy problems, and governments trying to do too much rather than too little. So the solution to this not happening again is for government to get out of people's lives, not for different types of individuals to be running the response next time.
Well, and we're on the wrong trend for that at the moment.
We are on the wrong trend, and the word really is, and I think this is right, and it's actually, I probably credit Nick Hudson at Panda for drumming this into me, is the real ill that we need to be fighting is centralization.
Yeah.
So, and what because in this respect, we are, I think, we seem to be losing the battle, to my mind. So if you think about 20, 30 years ago, there were real calls for decentralization and decision making to go down in the for example, to the lowest common decision making in the EU, for example, and there was an ideological argument that was made, for example, by Thatcher, that was made, I don't want to say 30 years ago, I really meant 40 years ago, probably. There's ideological argument she was making would now not hold water at all, which is that we need to make government smaller,
right.
And an ideological commitment to shrinking government down to as low as it can possibly be, to allow people to make whatever decisions with their own money that they wish to make. And that is completely out of vogue now. We are now in a position where we've seen growth of government, and the previous government, this so-called austerity measures, of course, saw a huge increase in public debt and a huge expansion of government spending. The austerity was only against ridiculous growth in spending to slightly less ridiculous growth in spending. So we are, and so we're now in a position where there are more and more, global organizations trying to centralize power and centralized decision making, etc. So I think the thing that people should be fighting is centralization and calling for decentralization. That would be, I think that's the kind of new, to my mind, that is the new version or the replacement of left versus right paradigm, centralized versus decentralized.
But there's quite a long way to go to get there, and I just want to come back to that point in a second. But I mean, just to illustrate your point, when was the last time that you heard the EU talk about the principle of subsidiarity? And it was in the 80s.
Big thing. Yeah, correct.
Franz Josef Strauss, who was the Bavarian prime minister, who was, and it was hard to disagree with it, because that's what the Swiss system's based on. The cantons make the decision for whatever happens in those cantons, and people vote on it. And why should you have a law that deals with heat that applies to Finland, when it doesn't get hot enough for it to be whatever it is? I mean, there's a complete nonsense in applying laws at a supranational level that have no impact on certain parts, and therefore the notion that those things should be decided with relevance to what happens locally is there. But that principle's gone. Subsidiarity is completely gone from the EU. It's disappeared with Franz Josef Strauss. And if you, to the earlier point you were making about swine flu. One of the reasons why that didn't take hold properly was, first of all, there was Wolfgang Wodak, the socialist MP, German MEP, who was a scientist, a doctor, and you probably know him. I've only met him online, but who
I've never met him.
realized very quickly that it wasn't this wasn't serious, wasn't real, and got the scientific evidence. But the other, and he was vocal in publicizing that within the EU. But the other reason, of course, is that the powers that be didn't have the press under control, and so what came out
Absolutely, they
from the
didn't.
press
It didn't have sufficient marketing budget.
yeah, yeah,
The whole thing. So I mean, the other thing is possibly the fact that we have probably dramatically increased the amount of testing and sequencing that can be done, high throughput sequencing, and I think that's an important part of maintaining the whole pandemic narrative is the number of tests rolled out and the amount of sequencing done. And an observation that I have made that I think is significant is that these sort of finding of new pathogens and declaring pandemics or pandemic risks is something that really is a feature of the 21st century. Not really much before it. And I do think that is because of the advent of sequencing technologies. So I think we are finding, we don't really know what novel means anymore. So we are finding things which we don't understand the actual practical significance of, and we're declaring them as dangers and pathogens that we ought to be scared of, and so on. And that is because we're able to do all this sort of sequencing that we don't really understand what its significance is. And testing.
Certainly the people who are submitted to those don't understand it, but are impressed by the propaganda.
And there's huge sums of money involved. There's billions involved in it, which is again another thing why it's self propagating and self perpetuating, and that there is businesses, careers built on it, and so on. And it's the similarities actually to the whole climate thing are quite uncanny, because a lot of the criticism of that science can also be leveled at climate science as well, which it becomes completely self-perpetuating. Nobody wants to end the party because everybody's having such a great time.
We've just gone over the hour, and we've probably got a bit of time left before I've exhausted you with questions. But I think it's I guess I just want to come back on really two things. One is we're seeing what's happening in the US with RFK Jr. And his role and there are lots of theories going in different directions, but looking at that on balance, it's hard to see that opening the lid on some of these practices, whether one believes that he's somehow conflicted in that or not, has to be a good thing. But I wonder, A, you might want to comment on that, and B, we tend to be 3, 4, 5 years behind the US in terms of when we do the same thing, which sort of fits with the electoral pattern at this stage as well. I'd be interested in your thoughts on, first of all, how you see that working in the States, what impact it's having, and what the effect could be on the movement to create more transparency, because the power of pharma is huge. And then secondly, how long it takes us to, if you think we will, move in that same direction.
The big questions to end on. I kind of wax and wane looking at what's going on in the States and RFK and all this. I do wax and wane, go from periods of sort of profound pessimism to periods of only mild pessimism, and it sort of goes between those. I mean, on the one hand, some of the things that have been said and that they have said are you couldn't imagine ever having been said by previous administration, and that is better than if they hadn't been said. On the other hand, it's got a situation where children are being, thousands of children a month, I don't know the precise numbers, but it must be in the thousands, of babies are being injected with, let's set aside the childhood schedule, which is insane, you know, whatever it is, 80, 90 injections by the time they reach adulthood. That's insane. And maybe they'll, you know, questions being asked about that, but just concentrate on these mRNA injections. There are still babies. It's still recommended that babies receive these injections. And so, you know, I find it just, when to me, it's just so completely obvious that these are dangerous for adults, who in theory can say no, but to inject this stuff into babies is I can only describe it as profoundly evil, and it's happening under the watch of these people. I mean, the other thing is that, you know, the people who are these people who are running the show now over there, none of them see the picture as I see them, in terms of this whole pandemic situation having been completely concocted, faked, staged, whatever word you want to use it. And, you know, they still think that we need planning for the next pandemic. And that's disturbing for me, because then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, you know, I have a little bit of optimism that things are being said that have never been said before, and that might open the door to people questioning more broadly. But it is clear that they are, you know, incredibly powerful forces behind, which control what is said. And I think that isn't some. It's like trying to move course of an oil tanker. You know, you can push and push and push and see absolutely nothing for a long time. That could be where we're at.
Do you think there's any cause for optimism coming from a bad place, in the sense that increasingly parents of young children in the States are finding alarming rates of autism from all these, you know, 72 odd jabs they have to have in the first 18 months or whatever it is of their lives, and are beginning to make the association between those, and you know, often it's the aluminium adjuvant folk that's actually doing it. It isn't necessarily what's in the jab itself, apart from what's in the jab, obviously, but it's not the pathogen that's in the jab that's causing it, but it's the surplus of aluminium in it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's difficult. I always think it's difficult to judge at the moment what the prevalence of these kind of opinions in the general population is, because we see such a tightly curated and massaged view of things through social media. I mean, I don't think X is in any sense an open and transparent platform. I think it's completely, none of the social media platforms are. They're all manipulating our opinion, what we see, and how far things we say go, and for their own ends. So, and if you were to believe what you read on social media, yeah, we're making some real breakthroughs, and lots of people are getting the message. But I'm afraid that it kind of, just in the environment of people who no longer think about this and talk about this, it's put to bed. It's the opinion is still there that, thank goodness, the vaccine saved millions of lives, and we've got to prepare for the next one. That's the general opinion held by the majority of people. If you ignore the silos and echo chambers that we tend to occupy our time with, unfortunately.
So I mean, are you, if one were to summarize that, are you basically saying that more people would have to come to the belief that in general vaccines are more harmful than good, and therefore that is the class that needs to be ripped off?
Well, I think probably. Well, we've not got time to go into all the layers of beliefs that have to be challenged, but suffice it to say that, you know, when you look at majority of science that's been done, which supports this edifice, there is a distinct lack of controls within those scientific experiments. So it all seems to be built on. I read a good description, certainly of the vaccine safety arguments, because remember, they do, how they establish vaccine safety is they compare it against an active comparator and say it's no, but of course we can't do a placebo trial because it would be unethical, because blah, blah, blah. So they call that the vaccine safety Ponzi scheme, which I think is quite good, combining this. So I think that idea of building layers of belief systems on things that aren't properly sound, and then creating a coherent sounding model using those, which explains what you want it to explain, I think is a major part of our problem, and that underlies quite a lot of our science. I mean, it underlies climate science, obviously, for example, and I think it probably applies. I'm no expert on it, but I am more and more thinking it applies to a lot of virology, certainly as far as it goes to what are purportedly respiratory illnesses. I mean, it is notable, and not something that really has been explained. It is notable that the deliberate infection challenge studies have largely had close to 100% failure. So trying to deliberately transfer contagion from one person under the most optimal conditions, meant to be this even more optimal than people in real life. If you can't transfer that contagion and cause that illness in the other person, which they seem to have great difficulty doing, then there is something very wrong with their operating model. And yet the whole pandemic narratives depends on that operating model. So, what gives?
And just before I come to the last point, which is really more about naturopathy and where that might be going, just before I come to that, just so you have a chance to put that thought in the back of your mind, I'd be interested in you saying at the end a bit more about what you're writing about, where your focus is now in what you do on Substack. But while you're thinking about that, see how well we can both multitask as males. What I find interesting, and I'd love your thoughts on it, what I'm seeing that's interesting is a lot of impromptu groups, whether it's WhatsApp or Signal or Threema or whatever, of people with acquiring some knowledge which arguably was human knowledge for centuries and was arguably pushed out of the door by the allopathic stuff that came in, is coming back, and it's having some remarkable successes, albeit in small groups. And that gives me some hope as to humanity thinking about some core things that we have known for longer than we've not known them, even though in the interim we've forgotten about them. The confidence with which some of these things which we know are natural and we know in and of themselves. I mean, just to give a silly example, if you can't eat something, why would you logically want to smear it on your skin? So if it's okay to drink organic coconut oil, then it's probably fine to put it on your skin. If it's not okay to drink it, you probably shouldn't be putting it on your skin. I mean, there's beginning to be just a bit of my senses of rethinking about reassessing how people look at that. What do you think that's? I mean, it's in pockets, but do you think that has some hope of becoming a bit more of a driver to a return to, if you can call it medical sanity, I don't know. But
yeah, I think so, and I think there does seem to be some evidence of a growing interest in challenging some of the assumptions that are made by modern medical science. So yeah, I think there is some hope for that, and of course I write on switching to what I write on my Substack, I write on obviously a variety of sort of health matters, and particularly as they relate to pharma treatment, big pharma tactics and so on, clinical trials, the way they're run and so on. But the way I would sort of characterize the change that we really need to be seeing in science and medicine is towards an appreciation of complexity. So a lot of the problems with modern medicine and modern science come from hubris, and that hubris is basically a belief that we understand a system well enough to interfere with a key component of it, and it won't have any side effects. It won't have any unintended consequences. So the sort of example, a good example being, we think that because people with hypercholesterolemia, familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a genetically inherited condition where people have cholesterol through the roof and they need to be lowered, and because that is good for them, we can lower cholesterol and it has no side effects and no concerns. We can just lower it, carry on lowering it as low, and it'll carry on keep doing lowering our risk of heart disease and strokes, however low we put it. And of course, without appreciation of the complex involvement of cholesterol in metabolism, including brain metabolism and muscle metabolism and so on. And it's such a key component. And I think sometimes a lot of our problems come about because we don't appreciate the complexity of what we're trying to interfere with. So I'm just repeating myself really there. So we interfere with a small bit of it, and without realizing what we don't know, which is that you're going to have second or third order effects, and those are almost certainly going to be harmful. Another example being lowering of blood pressure from mild to moderately raised blood pressure, and particularly in elderly people. So all they need to do to register blood pressure medication now to the regulators is show it lowers blood pressure, because it's just taken as read that if you lower blood pressure, it's good. But it might, even if it is good for heart attacks and stroke reduction, how do you know that the lowering of blood pressure doesn't cause other harms that counterbalance any benefit you get from the lowering of reduction of risk of strokes and heart attacks? Because you don't know unless you do proper whole look at all cause morbidity and mortality in proper placebo-controlled trials. You don't know that, and this view that we understand all the systems results in us doing that. That's one of the causes why over the last 20 years the regulators have allowed us to look at so-called surrogate endpoints in registering new drugs, where you don't have to show net benefit, you just have to show that the marker you've identified is improved. And I think that's a huge fallacy, because behind it all is an assumption that lowering that thing or affecting that thing is net beneficial, and that's not necessarily true. Going back to the elderly people, of course, if you treat blood pressure too much, particularly in the elderly, first of all, it affects their renal function, but also from a very practical perspective, it makes them get lightheaded, and it increases the rate of falls. And of course, falls in the elderly is a major cause of morbidity from fractured hips mainly. So these things that appear on the surface to be good and worthy things to do, when you look at the whole picture, they're not necessarily. So the word you could use there is holistic, and it's an overused word, but I think it is true that doctors who look at the whole patient, and rather than treating numbers according to protocols, might be coming back in vogue, and that is a good thing.
I think it's interesting also that the level of blood pressure at which concern is now being raised by the public health authorities is lower than it used to be. In other words, they've sort of reset the.
Well, this has been a pharma tactic. I mean, probably could talk for a long time about this, but this is a pharma tactic, which is to pathologize normal ranges of things, and to continually work to lobby governments and public health systems to continually lower targets, bringing more and more people into the treatment paradigm. And of course, the other thing about which I write about on my Substack is that once people start drugs, generally a lot of these chronic condition drugs, they never come off them. So you frequently get people in their 70s or 80s who go to hospital confused. They're on 8 different drugs, and of course, and as a side comment, you can never predict how so many drugs together, different drugs, are going to interact with each other, because you just can't. You can't try doing the trial of 8 combinations of 8 different products at random from the pharmacopoeia. You just can't do it. So when I was a junior doctor, when elderly people came in on lots of drugs, the first thing you would do is stop every single drug, and they would invariably dramatically improve in all respects. And then you just think about what is actually really vital and important and introduce it one by one. Whereas at the moment we have a situation where people are on insane numbers of drugs, and taking them for years, and and the trouble is that because of litigation and tick box medicine, doctors won't stop these things. I mean, I know people who have gone to their doctors and said, might I come off the statins? If you come off the statin, you'll have a heart attack the week after. They're saying this kind of nonsense. But that's where we are.
Well, I'm not sure it's the best note to end on, but is there anything you want to add? Anything you feel that we haven't covered in or summarised at the end? Do you think we've picked up most of the areas we wanted to be in? I think there's some hope in some pockets, I suppose one could say.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. But I very much, I think my focus in what I feel I can do is very much towards, telling small groups of people one by one what I know, and hoping that they tell other people, and that you gradually, we can move things around by a sort of grassroots, community-based informing people. I don't, unfortunately, have any faith that we can address the issues that we've had top down at all. I don't think that's going to happen. So I think we have a long-term sort of educational battle at the grassroots.
Yeah, stand in the park, as it were.
Yeah.
On that note, I think we should end and say thank you to those that are following and listening, and thank you very much for your time, Jonathan. I'm very much appreciate it. It's been great to catch up. Stay online while we go.
Absolute pleasure.
Off stream. Thank you so much, John. Good night.
Okay.